Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thanks for a terrific turnout. It's greatly appreciated. My name is Ross Virginia. I'm a faculty member in the Environmental Studies program, and I also direct the Institute of Arctic Studies here at Dartmouth, which is part of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce the holder of Dartmouth's Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Arctic Studies, Dr. Rafico Ruiz. This is the only Fulbright chair that's established at Dartmouth, and I'm very pleased because at first it builds on our very close working and valued relationship with Canada, but also, obviously, because it's dedicated to the pursuit of understanding interdisciplinary research problems in Arctic studies. Each year we have a Canadian Fulbright scholar in residence at Dartmouth for 4 to 6 months, and they'll be working with faculty and students to further their own research, but also to build networking between U.S. and Canada, and that's truly what the mission of the Dickey Center is all about. The Fulbright program, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the flagship international educational exchange program sponsored by the U.S. government, and it's designed to build mutual understanding between the U.S. and nations across the world. It was established in 1946 by Senator William Fulbright, and it's sponsored by the U.S. State Department with engagement of nations all across. I think there's 78 nations that are participating in Fulbright. To date, there's been more than 380,000 Fulbrighters, and since its inception, these scholars have gone on to do many, many amazing things. So we're very proud that Dartmouth is affiliated with Fulbright and that we're affiliated with Canada in that pursuit. Today's seminar is sponsored by Fulbright, obviously, the Dickey Center here at Dartmouth, the Institute of Arctic Studies, and the Office of the Consul General of Canada in Boston, which is led by the Honorable David Alward. With us and representing the consulate in Boston today is our good friend and colleague, Mark Jacques. Mark is here in the front. Mark serves as the Senior Political and Economic Affairs Attaché in Boston. Mark has helped organize and sponsored many events here at Dartmouth, the Dickey Center with Arctic, and he's also a valuable aid in Dartmouth scholars finding colleagues and assisting in arrangement of programs linking the U.S. and Canada. So Mark, always great to have you here. Thank you. I also want to give a special shout out to Dr. Michael Hawes. He's the CEO of Fulbright Canada. Without Michael's interest and support and the Fulbright Chair, Canada Fulbright Chair would not be at Dartmouth. And so Michael's done so much to facilitate this interaction, and he has a strong interest in political science and environment and Arctic studies, as you might guess. So let's talk a little bit about our speaker. Dr. Ruiz works in what I see as the broad area of environmental humanities, and he sort of sprinkles in elements from cultural geography, communication studies, technology, and you'll catch other things that are put in here. But what's very apparent that he's a highly interdisciplinary scholar, bringing together information from many different disciplines to shape our understanding of a very rapidly changing world in the Arctic. He completed his undergraduate work at McGill. He went on for a master's at Columbia in French Cultural Studies, and then he returned to McGill for his PhD in Communication Studies and the History and Theory of Architecture. There's another discipline in there. He's currently a Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada Banting Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Sociology at the University of Alberta. During his time here at Dartmouth, and he arrived in February, sometime in February during that horrific weather event there that we had, he's working on several different projects, but they're highly coordinated and linked. He's examining the development of telecommunications infrastructure in the circumpolar Arctic, a fundamental challenge in moving information across the north. And he's also looking at how this technology interacts with diverse indigenous environmental and legal frameworks that face the development of the communication industry, but also interface with extractive industries. So this is a very complex, complicated, and rich area for understanding and for shaping the future of the Arctic. He's now also finalizing his book, The Fish Came First, Extractive Environments and the Grenfell Mission of Newfoundland and Labrador, and this is being published by Duke University Press. So the other project he's working on is the one he's going to talk about today. And he's in the early phase of a book project, and it's tentatively titled Phase State Earth, Icebergs at the End of Climate Change. 2 years ago, I had the special opportunity to sail across the Arctic Ocean from Iqaluit, Baffin Island to Greenland. And partway across the Davis Strait, we encountered our first massive iceberg. And everyone ran up onto the top of the deck, including President Phil Hanlon and the Dartmouth alumni that I was with. And I was just sort of stopped and was staring at this iceberg. And I was immediately thinking about this big piece of ice. I knew where it came from in Greenland, thinking about the currents that brought it there, and all these various things. And then I realized that I'm surrounded by this mass of people with their cameras and their binoculars, and they're just awestruck by this piece of ice, right? And they're appreciating it and seeing it in a whole different way. And so I kind of let go of my sort of scientific interpretation at that moment and just flowed into it. And I think that experience really reinforced my understanding that we need all the disciplines to come together, and we need our senses to focus on the drivers of rapid change in the Arctic and what it means for us and for the peoples that live in this amazing place. Dr. Ruiz lives on the third floor of this building. That's where he has an office. He's on Dartmouth email. So if you want to know more about his work, you want to meet him. I know he's very eager to get out in the community and share his work and learn from you. So this is an introduction to him and his work, and we hope that you take advantage of that opportunity. Rafico is not here alone. He's here with his partner, Dr. Paulina Miksevic. She also has a PhD in communication studies. She's right here in the front, from McGill. And she's got a number of projects going. The one that she was finishing up is looking at the library and the impact of our new technologies, the way that we move information, the way that social media and other information technologies are changing the way libraries work and the ways that libraries interact with our social institutions and with public interest in democracy. So she's associated here at Dartmouth with the Department of Media and Film Studies. So Paulina also has a Dartmouth email, so if you're interested in her work, please take advantage of that. So it's great to have you both here. Welcome to Dartmouth. And so now let's hear a bit about this amazing subject here. The title of Rafico's talk is The Last Iceberg on Critical Optimism in the Anthropocene. And you'll define that term, right?
Of course.
Okay. Welcome, Rafico.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ross, for the really kind introduction. And yeah, I do feel like I live here, actually, because I feel so warmly welcomed. And you, Melody, Lee, everyone at the Institute of Arctic Studies has really been so generous with their time. And yeah, before I start, I'd also like to thank Fulbright Canada. It's really a wonderful program. I'm really glad this is a sort of crucial time for these sorts of programs. And to some extent, I feel like I'm doing my small part to save NAFTA a little bit. Maybe. Let's hope. Yeah, good luck. So I'd like to start with there's an echo with the double mic, or is it fine? It's okay? Okay. I'd like to start with, I guess we could think of as a exercise of the imagination. Oh, and I forgot to thank all of you for being here, by the way. Thank you for the attendance. Really, really greatly appreciated. So it's an exercise of the imagination. Here's a scenario. We're in some unspecified moment in the future, hopefully sort of distant future. The polar ice caps and the Greenlandic ice sheet have melted, as we know they may, as many models have forecasted, and large parts of the world's continents are submerged underwater. So the question that presents itself maybe is, what remains of the cryosphere? What remains of the part of the world that is defined by the uninterrupted presence of ice? So my answer, as the title of my talk suggests, is the last iceberg. So yes, a single iceberg might be all that remains of the Greenlandic ice sheet, all that remains of the immense glacial shells of Antarctica. So in lots of ways, this is really the figure I want to anchor my talk this evening. Icebergs really are these rich symbols of our planet's changing ecological conditions. But they're symbols not only of the changing ecological conditions that are producing ever more of them, but as we know from this well-worn expression, they're also symbols of what we don't know about climate change and the future. So really our present ecological conditions are really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the future changes that are to come. So the photographer Camille Seaman, does anyone know her work? Possibly? No? Good, okay. Over the past decade, more or less, has undertaken a sort of unconventional photographic project. She's described it as a portraiture project. So she's really set out to document the world's icebergs before they disappear. And her goal is to really treat an iceberg with the same care and attention as one might give to a human face. So they really are portraits. And so while the implied future in Seaman's project might seem far off, to some extent beyond the comprehension of our sort of limited human timescales, in many ways it's a future that's distributed across the latitudes of planet Earth today, right now. So while the concentric rings that divide the planet into manageable and navigable degrees might seem to have everything to do with geography, I'd say they also have to do with the relationships between past, present, and future. They have everything to do with how human societies experience ecological timeframes generated by global warming. So in this sense, latitudes are futures. So today, in cultural terms, for Southern societies, and I would include us within that term, and by that term I mean communities located outside of the immediate ecological zone of the cryosphere, there really has been quite a bit of talk, and you've probably heard it, about our approaching this condition of last ice. To some extent, this is largely figured as a sort of material barometer, particularly with regards to sea ice extent in the Arctic Ocean. But it's also appeared as a sort of symbolic motivation, an elegy for a part of the planet that we are very rapidly losing through melt. And lastly, and probably most importantly, last ice has less often referred to the dramatic effects this condition is having on human life worlds. In this sense, these climate change-driven futures are being lived right now by indigenous groups across the circumpolar world contending with the effects of global warming. Again, latitudes are futures. So our temporal and spatial markers can be reoriented if we understand such supposedly remote geographies as actually living and experiencing changes that will eventually be coming to more southern latitudes. And yet, the question that I'd like all of us to think with this evening is that of how to be optimistic today. So in the face of melting glaciers, sea level rise, atmospheric warming, really in the face of the sort of sheer inhuman scale of phenomena such as global climatic change, how to maintain a relationship with an unknowable future based on hope. So that's sort of the question I want to pursue this evening. But before pursuing it, I want to actually put it another way. So rather than how to be optimistic today, what if we asked, do we have a responsibility to be optimistic in the present moment? So what does this difference suggest? For me, this suggests a sense of intergenerational responsibility. And I'm so glad we have another generation here to listen to this and to participate. And so to some extent, a commitment to a sense of maintenance and care for the Earth in a situated, if ongoing, and unspecified future. I think there's also an implied ethics here too. And that ethics is one of not letting go to the possibility of the future. I think some people have, to some extent, lost sight of that today. And if, as I mentioned, thousands of circumpolar residents are living right now the latitude futures of climate change, this should be an ethics that is turned towards their present. So in that sense, we have a responsibility to turn towards the future, I would say, to really fully address it. And to me, this means we have a responsibility towards establishing the conditions of possibility for the appearance of optimism. So I'm going to actually repeat that. We have a responsibility towards establishing the conditions of possibility for the appearance of optimism. So to some extent, yes, I'm sort of hedging a bit. I'm being, to some extent, sort of cautious. Optimism, I would say, is an outlook that needs to be cultivated. It's not just there for us to take. Optimism is really a human condition that can be contradictory and can challenge our sense of ethical legitimacy even. As I hope you'll discover in the course of my talk, we have to recognize that different societies actually establish different relationships with anthropogenic environmental change, and thus with a sort of lived spectrum of optimisms. So, for example, in a place such as Greenland, the unprecedented melting of the ice sheet is, to some extent, cause for optimism. What, you might say? No. Well, yes, the receding ice is actually producing large quantities of a substance called glacial rock flour. And glacial rock flour is actually an emerging sort of super fertilizer in the world of agriculture. The melting ice sheet is also drastically increasing the flow rates of certain rivers in Greenland. And this increased flow rate is presenting the possibility of huge hydroelectric potential, which will really turn Greenland into a massive exporter of hydroelectricity. So in a way, in Greenland, climate change is cause for optimism in this sort of near future, if we want to call it that. And yet, of course, it's also cause for a certain amount of doubt in the long-term viability of coastal communities. So as you hopefully see, I'm not really taking optimism as a sort of one-size-fits-all emotional and cognitive position, but rather I'm thinking about optimism as the means through which we are negotiating, sort of in the process of negotiating, an understanding of our shared ecological future. So the American philosopher Lauren Berlant understands there to be what she calls a cruel optimism at work in the world today. So for her, cruel optimism is, quote, the condition of maintaining an attachment to a significantly problematic object. Yet, in her formulation, it's not just the object that's problematic, right? It's our relationship to that very object. So she goes on, a relation of cruel optimism is a double bind, in which your attachment to an object that sustains you in life at the same time as that object is actually a threat to your flourishing. So what does this relation resemble? What does this cruel optimism call up for you? For me, I'd say it resembles our relation to the planet today. It resembles our relation to the future. It even resembles our relation to optimism itself. So in this optic, to some extent, Greenland can all at once be a source of spiritual sustenance for Greenlandic hunters, a source of potential hydroelectricity, and a source of sea level rise. So as Ross mentioned, in the work I do as a scholar across the polar environmental humanities, to some extent, these are the sorts of dynamics that I study. I don't so much study objects, but rather, I like to think I study relationship-building phenomena. So glaciers build relationships with both human and non-human entities. As the Canadian anthropologist Julie Cruikshank asked in a really wonderful book, Do Glaciers Listen? She tells us, yes, definitely. For Tlingit and other indigenous groups, yes, they do. And to some extent, I think it's our turn to listen to what they have to say as well. The southern society outside of the cryosphere. So what I'd like to do for the majority of this talk then is to track across three positions of optimism. So you'll recall that I mentioned that optimism is profoundly context-specific, a sort of spectrum position. So the first position I'll discuss, and it sort of corresponds to the sections of my talk, the first condition of optimism I'll discuss is one I call threshold optimism. So 2 degrees Celsius, I would say, even though we're in an American context here, is likely quite a consequential number for a lot of people in this room. It's, to some extent, the most readily discernible outcome of the Paris Climate Accord, we could say. And it represents the commitment the vast majority of the world's nations have made to maintaining global temperature rise to this number, to sort of in relation to pre-industrial levels. So in the first section, I'll go into more depth around how this is a goal, to some extent, that people see as being, that can be accomplished through this condition of what I call threshold optimism. The second position of optimism I'll discuss is one that I call present optimism. This is, to some extent, a complex position, and it's not dissimilar to the one I talked about in Greenland. That without ignoring the effects or denying the effects of global warming or its existence, it maintains an optimism in the conditions that are being created by environmental change. So I'll examine this condition of present optimism in relation to an emergent tourism industry in the small town of Twillingate in the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So it'll get at some of your awe in the face of an iceberg, Ross, I hope. And finally, the concluding section of my talk will touch on what I call Earth optimism. This position maintains, I would say, a sense of hope in the homeostatic principle of ecology, that in time, balance might be restored to the Earth if we can learn to live better within it. So again, these are really positions on a spectrum. We could maybe think of them as intensities of hope on what people have called the blue marble, which is, of course, a planet that we continue to inhabit. So we have this responsibility to live well. So the first section is threshold optimism. So as I said, for the 195 signatories, that number may drop slightly, or has dropped slightly, I guess, maybe to 194 now, of the Paris Climate Accord, we are living through an ongoing and momentous threshold. We often think of thresholds as very distinct boundaries between inside and outside, a door, a window. However, when it comes to the sort of gradual and cumulative effects of climate change, it is as if the entire Earth is inhabiting a threshold condition that to some extent is experienced through our warming atmosphere. So to some extent, you could also think of it as a balloon slowly being blown up, breath after breath. To some extent, this is how time is unfolding today in increments of warming air. And so, of course, after all the policy discussions, the pursuit of consensus, of climate action, the Paris Climate Accord really staked a form of optimism in this particular threshold. As I said, keeping global temperature rise to a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. As you likely know, in order to achieve this goal, individual nations have committed to implementing nationally determined contributions towards the decrease of greenhouse gas emissions. So my understanding of the kind of threshold optimism produced through the Climate Accord is that it relies on the continual production of climate evidence. So what do I mean by climate evidence? What I mean is the scientific and empirical construction of a sense of urgency around the time sensitivity of such effects of global warming as uncertain food production, species loss, and sea level rise. In some ways, these are the sticks that the 2 degree Celsius carrot relies on. This sort of industry in the best sense of scientific empiricism that can produce a body of evidence that pushes us towards this threshold optimism. So as such, for me, as someone coming from the polar environmental humanities, as maybe some of the students in this room do, at least from the humanities side of things, this entailed spending some time with the scientists who actually produced this evidence. It entailed trying to better understand how the projection that climate models make, and we always sort of experience as sort of media subjects or citizens. I wanted to learn how these climate models operate at both not only the technical level, but also a cultural level. So for the latter, on the cultural side of things, projection, as we know, is a sort of cultural position that forecasts a future warning so that human behavior can shift in the present. So producing climate evidence today is very often tied to future ecological states. There's always this sense of projection. And it was actually in April of 2015 that NASA launched a major initiative to ascertain what effects Greenland's melting glaciers will have on global sea level rise. As you see, as part of its Earth System Science Pathfinder program, the Oceans Melting Greenland scientific team has really sought to address the extent to which the bathymetric dimensions of glaciers, so their underwater dimensions where they interact with North Atlantic water, are interacting with the water and the seafloor in order to determine to what degree, how quickly they're melting. And the project's stated goal is to improve the accuracy of data describing ocean ice interactions and to forecast with precision, like I said, the potential amount of global sea level rise to come in the near term. So it's a sort of temporal scope is trying to limit it to sort of 2030. So over the past couple of years, I've undertaken what I call media ethnographic work. So looking at how, in a sort of media technology sense, these models get produced. So not so much from a technical side of things, but more from this media study side of things. So I've been spending some time with the Oceans Melting Greenland project team at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. And so as I said, the time I've spent there with the project team is sought to document how the project's glacier-related knowledge production is the outcome of what I call the media environment interface. So these include all manner of instruments, such as temperature and salinity probes, which is more or less what AXCTD, what they do, imagery from an ice surface topography interferometer, and bathymetric geometry readings. Amongst really other forms, a wide array of visual and graphical evidence that are documenting the evolving relationships between melting ice and warming ocean water. In a way, my goal has really been to try to think alongside these processes of model updating in order to track how projection can emerge as an empirical basis for the cultural concerns surrounding the production of climate evidence. So, you too, humanists, can go into these highly scientific contexts and learn something and also contribute something to the scientists. So as I mentioned, Oceans Melting Greenland is an Earth observation mission. So while conducted by NASA, in a way, their Earth observation missions at NASA are sort of like the pre-trial space phase for a lot of these technologies. They actually get tested on Earth first. And as you may have noticed, some of you may have noticed, it's a project with a very apt acronym, OMG. And so over the course of the next 5 years, OMG will take annual measurements, as I said, that will track the extent to which global warming is modifying the volume, density, and hence melt rate of the Greenlandic ice sheet. So the principal investigator behind OMG, very nice guy pictured here, Josh Willis, and he's an oceanographer by training, and to some extent, Willis is also a bit of a renegade in the culture of NASA and the JPL. During my time with him and the other JPL and the other, OMG scientists, it actually really became clear that only a very small minority of JPL-affiliated scientists actually pursue global warming research. And in addition, not only pursue global warming research, but actively foreground and publicly communicate the implications of the Earth monitoring that they're undertaking. So these, Josh shared these slides with me, and I was pretty shocked to learn that this was the slide that he opened his big annual presentation to NASA executives with. I was like, no, you didn't. He's like, yes, I did. So in our conversations, Willis described to me a sort of marginalized culture of speaking truth to power. As the case of the well-known climate scientist James Hansen bears out, likely a familiar name to a lot of you, that at the time, this was last February when I was doing some of my ethnographic work there, where it was really being exacerbated by the unknowns then presented by the Trump administration's relationship to environmental research and to NASA as a funding priority more broadly. Those have to some extent been worked out, but not fully. And a case in point, I would say, of this culture is the logo of the OMG mission that Willis designed himself, partly in the face of resistance from NASA administration. So to a Canadian, I would say, Josh has a very LA background in acting, improv, and stand-up comedy. So he's a sort of oceanographer by day. And he takes his brand of science communication very seriously. He spent hours and hours designing this, and it really does see it as a form of creative work. And he described to me how the majority of such mission logos, and you've likely seen these, feature the instrument that they rely on as a central design element, which, as you can see, is absent here. And he likened it to the graphics of Reagan's Star Wars missile defense system that he saw during his childhood. This is sort of the aesthetic precursor. But Willis told me that these logos, quote, don't tell you anything about the science, these sort of instrument-heavy ones. Whereas the very acronym OMG, in addition, as we know, to being apropos and humorous, conveys a fact and is really all about the why. Oceans melting Greenland, warming oceans melting Greenland's ice sheet. So he's actually struggled with NASA to keep any other recognizable acronyms off the logo. So as Willis put it in relation to the project's circulating sticker come logo, this is actually a sticker. This is a quote, "My concession is that NASA is on the back, the part that you peel off and throw away," which I thought was very clever. So as with many geophysical forms of observation, OMG, to some extent, is really driven by the instrumentation available to them through NASA and the JPL. So Willis, describing to me the grant writing stage of the project, noted how many of the parameters of the science question were really shaped by the expectations and capacities of NASA as a remote sensing agency. So to some extent, to interpret that a little bit, it means the technologies available to them as Earth observers not only drove, but to some extent you could say limited the sorts of science questions they were going to ask. So given this need to observe from a distance in order to fulfill institutional priorities, Willis says that the in situ observations, so more or less the ocean component of the data collection, largely those salinity probes, could be thought of as correlating data that had to be justified by monitoring aspects of the ice sheet from above and below. In some ways, this sort of volumetric turn to Greenland's marine terminating glaciers came about as a result of an instrument and institutional culture-led approach. Again, it's technology driving science. But it's also important to note how this constraint has led to a reshaping of the scientific practices of OMG-affiliated oceanographers and glaciologists, accustomed to focusing squarely on their chosen phenomena, water and ice. As I learned during my time at the JPL, oceanographers and glaciologists actually don't hang out that much together, and neither do their models, as I'll talk about in a second. So in this sense, ocean-ice interaction, which is the primary science question that drives the project, became what you could think of as a sort of boundary condition that really forced these two earth sciences to consider how their respective volumetric analyses need to integrate the dynamic interfaces of marine terminating glaciers into their modeling cultures. So Ian Fenty, an oceanographer with OMG, described to me how here in the MIT General Circulation Model, which is an open access global ocean model that's to some extent part of the common oceanographic culture at NASA. So until very recently, the ice shelves of the Northern Hemisphere figured in this model as more or less as sort of blank walls, the equivalent of land, without all the complex cavities and geometries that we know glaciers possess. Fenty also told me how early global climate models didn't actually even include the polar regions, as lots of forms of Earth observation, so sort of satellite-driven Earth observation, didn't go above or below 66 degrees north and south. So during my time at the JPL, Fenty was actually in the process of inserting Greenland's ice shelves into the MIT GCM, working off some of the data collected by OMG and then sort of correlating it with new global mapping data of the seafloor. So while the absence of polar data in oceanographic models can, to some extent, be explained by the pace of global warming, it's also a testament to the difficulties of integrating large-scale Earth science models with one another. They're really hugely complex systems, and even in terms of computing capacity, it really takes sort of servers and computing power located only at a place like the JPL to actually be able to do this science. So the American historian Paul Edwards, who's really done some tremendous work on the history of global climate models, notes the unmanageable scale, as I said, of experimenting with global climate systems. So thus the onus and fora of experimentation shift to analogous simulation models that forecast, with some extent with increasing precision, the evolution of the Earth's, what he called so-called measurable realities. So in this sense, Greenland, in slowly going from ice to water, is currently emerging today, we could say, as a global hub in the production of data forms that are substantially modifying existing model-based simulations. So really gone, as we know, are the days when satellites could orbit outside of the poles. And in this sense, too, Greenland, we could say, is becoming a hub in the production of climate evidence that can really start to shore up the goal of limiting atmospheric warming to 2 degrees Celsius. So if it's not a place you've thought about, you should probably start thinking about it more. But to circle back to the project's logo and acronym, So the work OMG does in both realms of scientific empiricism and cultural concern for the environment, I would say is part of this broader commitment to an optimism of the threshold, that climate effects can be harnessed. So if our first reaction to current projections of sea level rise is OMG, as it often is, the crucial next step is to really build this evidentiary base to curb greenhouse gas emissions, to, I would say in other words, maintain an optimism in the threshold. Okay, I'll move on to my second section on present optimism. So one way to be optimistic in the present, I would say, is to see climate change in the context of paradigms of environmental emergence. Well, ecological systems, as we know, are always slowly evolving and adapting to particular circumstances. That this new era that has come to be known as the Anthropocene, to define it as Ross asked, an era defined by human-created impacts that are registered in the geological record. So this really emergent era, geological periodization that is driven and defined by human impacts on the planet. Well, this Anthropocene has accelerated these rates of evolution adaptation and shifted, we could say, planetary ecologies towards a sort of continual fast forward of emergence. And so this process shouldn't necessarily be understood as straightforwardly human-caused, but proceeding in tandem with the environment's evolutionary field. So ambient conditions that are generated through ocean, air, sun, and other phenomena. Environments, of course, as we know in ecology, are always emergent, but with climate change, they are emerging both faster and in more unpredictable ways. Within our southern societies, we are experiencing this. In the United States, California sort of holds an emblematic position with regards to this condition. But shifted into a political economic context, particularly an Arctic one, emergent ecologies can also mean emergent resources. Think about sea ice giving way to year-round navigation through the Northwest Passage, or to the exploration of northern oil and gas deposits. These are sort of narratives we've heard about as well. But in a place like Newfoundland and Labrador, icebergs are actually increasingly being included in this paradigm of economic emergence, and are indeed emerging as contested northern natural resources. Has anyone ever drank iceberg water? Okay, enjoyable. No, yeah. So this region, Iceberg Alley, that stretches from the western glaciers of Greenland, east to Baffin Island, and south to the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. Oh, this is my pointer. So just down to here. As we know, the sort of most famous iceberg of all time exceeded these projections and went further south with hit the Titanic in 1912, or Titanic hit it. So in lots of ways, as Ross actually sort of also mentioned, the Labrador Current, you see here, so picks up the icebergs that break off of largely the western coast of Greenland, actually brings them north and then south again. And to some extent, you could think about this as like a sort of giant conveyor belt. And usually when ice pack frees up a little bit, by spring and summer, the icebergs arrive, Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So for entrepreneurs in Newfoundland and Labrador today, icebergs really are cause for this present optimism. They are expanding the boundary of what can count as a quote-unquote natural resource. And here, to some extent, the material properties of ice can be translated into commodity-driven forms. So as you've been seeing, whether as luxury branded waters, regional novelty vodkas, might be of more interest to some people, I don't know. Water's not your thing. But also, it's everyone's. But this goes to, Ross, what you're talking about a little bit, to actually the immaterial dimensions of this resource. And so this goes towards the locating, viewing, and sharing of image-driven experiences of icebergs across different media platforms. This condition of present optimism can make out the instrumental necessities and what you could think of as maybe the ethical gray zones created by global warming. As I said, thanks to the Labrador Current, most years in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, the ice is there for the taking, both sort of experientially and literally as water or vodka or beer, actually. So I'm going to take you to Twillingate, town of Twillingate. Has anyone been to Twillingate? No. Oh, wonderful. Okay. I'd suggest going in June, which is sort of prime iceberg season. So Twillingate is actually an island, off of an island, but it's actually connected to the mainland of Newfoundland by a causeway. And you can see it has a very deep harbor. So pictured here with the very distinctive hat is a character known as the Iceberg Man, aka Cecil Stockley. So I got to know Cecil a little bit in June of 2016 when I was doing some field work in Twillingate. And Cecil's a retired gym and social science teacher. So if any retirees in the room, there's a second life as iceberg entrepreneurs, possibly. But he actually he didn't seem that old. He retired in the early 1980s. I guess he's a teacher. Sometimes they retire early. And so he actually started his business back then. So it's about 30 years ago. And I guess it could have been a sideline too. So he actually took people out in small wooden boats who wanted to get close to the icebergs that would pass through Twillingate Harbor, largely more or less sort of May to August. And this was quite unique at the time because in the province, and generally in sort of maritime coastal world, icebergs were really seen as nuisance objects. You know, they were incredibly dangerous for lots of forms of maritime navigation, and they would break crab pots, entangle fishing nets. So in some extent, he was really a bit of an outlier in the town of Twillingate itself, going against its cultural, sort of dominant culture when it came to icebergs. So Cecil really was one of the earliest people to see the uniqueness of Twillingate's location. And this is his new boat, not his original wooden boat. I was thankful for that. And he really sees Twillingate as being quite fortunate in being located where it is in relation to the Labrador Current. He recognized how it is very much a seasonal industry. Like I said, June is likely the best time of year to go. No guarantees, though. Every year it changed. And it is really a matter of ecology-based luck, we could say. And these days, Stockley is no longer unique in seeing the particularities of Twillingate's location. So they dub themselves the iceberg capital of the world. Actually, he objects to this designation. He thinks it does, for Arctic people, there are lots of different designations. He thinks it belongs in the Antarctic. Ilulissat in Greenland is actually Greenlandic for iceberg. So they have a claim to this title too, but Twillingate has claimed it nonetheless. And so Stockley we could really think of as an iceberg entrepreneur. And when he was talking to me, he cited one of his own early influences was a local photographer named John Loveridge. And in the 1970s, Loveridge took a series of photographs of distinctive icebergs in and around Newfoundland. Any guesses as to what? Trojan horse? Sort of. This one? Anyone? Model? Yogi Bear, actually. Specifically, not just any bear. And then the last one. A witch. Yes, this is probably the best one. A witch. So leverage was actually, these are incredibly odd and unique specimens, these postcards, because he really was going against this dominant culture of seeing icebergs as these nuisance objects. So these are really pretty unusual. But for Stockley, leverage really played this crucial part in helping him to see icebergs differently. And it was pretty apparent on one of his cruises. So it was 2 hours of Cecil without a mic, somehow, over the wind, narrating all the sort of the individual features of bergs, how each notch forms in relation to currents, the above and below water ratios of the bergs, and how they influence, quote unquote, her form. For Stockley, bergs are always she's, quote, because they're unpredictable. I had to not say anything, but he's a big guy. And the ways in which bergs can really reflect hard or soft light of the water. And as the weather does in Newfoundland, our tour started off with this bright North Atlantic light, giving each berg a sort of sculptural and dynamic quality. The weather very quickly turned, and the bergs seemed to become laden and heavy. And this transformative quality of the light, I would say, seemed to have the bergs travel along this experiential axis of them as visual spectacles, as Ross, you sort of experienced. And to me, it brought to mind Stockley's or Cecil's affirmation of the value these icebergs could hold as what could be thought of as immaterial natural resources. So that is in the set of relationships and social practices that we could establish with them. So from touring to photographing. And over the years, Stockley has had, you can imagine, quite a few tussles with iceberg harvesters. So if you're on a tour trying to sort of describe the aesthetic properties and other properties of an iceberg, and then a boat comes along and starts taking the iceberg apart, that's a problem. So he has had a few tussles with iceberg harvesters over the years. But to some extent, how he approaches icebergs is really as relational resources. And it echoes one of the foundational paradigms of resource studies, which I'll just read very quickly. And it's Eric Zimmerman, 1933 book. It still holds true today. The word resource does not refer to a thing nor substance, but to a function which a thing or a substance may perform, or to an operation in which it may take part, namely the function or operation of attaining a given end, such as satisfying a want. In other words, the word resource is an abstraction reflecting human appraisal and relating to a function or operation. As such, it is akin to such words as food, property, or capital, but much wider in its sweep than any of these. So to some extent, it was really through this optic that I saw Stockley's icebergs going from hard to soft light. Hard had my fellow tourgoers bringing out their cameras, capturing the visual spectacle and pleasure in icebergs as aesthetic resources. And soft light, by contrast, brought back this sort of solidity and impassive there-ness of bergs that were heavy, dangerous, and amenable for towing and melting. So during my time with Stockley, he mentioned how the new St. John's-based tour companies, that's the capital of the province, that have established themselves in Twillingate and have started to offer more frequent departure times, tour and dinner packages, things of that sort, really started to threaten his business until he established a sort of wider social media presence. And while there is a pretty discernible contrast between this is the Iceberg Man premises on the wharf in Twillingate, decorated with various iceberg art and portrait of, I imagine, Cecil on his rickety wooden boat in the 80s. And so a contrast between this and the Iceberg Man social media presence, we could say that they really are in a continuum of what Zimmerman calls resourceship. So this is a practice that, quote, stems from the purposeful interaction of natural, cultural, and human factors primed and kept going by demand based on availability for use. Resourceship. That's really what Stockley was trying to do. And in making icebergs experientially available, we could really think of him as a founding figure in actually establishing the creation of a shifting function that icebergs are now fulfilling. And to some extent, too, we could think about resourceship as really the raison d'etre of this condition of present optimism. And so while Stockley and other iceberg entrepreneurs don't necessarily negate the existence of climate change, they see it as an unfolding environmental disaster that is bringing more, if smaller, icebergs to their oceanfront door. So through global warming, the icebergs continue to emerge, and I would say that present optimism presents the conditions for them to emerge into commodities. Okay, so my concluding section is called Earth Optimism. So as I mentioned at the outset of my talk, this position maintains a sort of, I would say, a sense of hope in the homeostatic principle of ecology. As I said, that in time, balance might be restored if we can improve the way we live with the Earth today. So while this position doesn't ignore or discount the effects of global warming, it retains, we could say, maybe a more local sensibility and attention to one's immediate environment. While climate accords are signed and greenhouse gas emissions are curbed, the vast majority of humans go about their day-to-day lives, living and working. To some extent, there's an inherent time bias, we could say, in the cultural effects of climate change. While it creates a more uncertain emotional and cognitive understanding of the future, it also leaves our present moment hanging in a sort of ambivalent stasis. We're both powerless, but also the only species in the Anthropocene who can determine our own fate. So, to some extent, that leads to that difficult question that we've been thinking with: how to be optimistic today? How to live with this mundane, everyday realities of climate change? So this line of questioning brought to mind two artifacts that I've come to discover during my time here at Dartmouth. And I sort of use the term artifact very intentionally in this archaeological sense. So artifacts are objects that fulfill a sort of stratigraphic function, right? They are human records established in relation to their ambient environments. I'm actually going to touch, just in the interest of time, because I do want to give at least 15 minutes for questions. I'm just going to go through this first one a little more quickly, and then the second, give a little more time to the second one. So this is a book at the Rauner Library, so you're free to go consult it. The Arctic Regions. It was published in 1873 and put together by William Bradford, an American painter and photographer. It's an incredible book. It's hard to actually, well, it looks huge here, but it is actually quite huge. It's sort of, I don't know, like that in height and like that in width. And it's a remarkable book, and I was looking through it last week, and what's remarkable about it is that it contains photographs from the 1860s of Bradford's expedition to Greenland. His expedition, I think, took place in 1869. At the time, photography wasn't a really straightforward practice. It required a lot of equipment. So actually getting really what would be, in essence, a mobile darkroom to Greenland would have been a huge, huge feat. And I sort of tried to look at the book through the eyes of an Earth optimist. And what struck me most through the eyes of the Earth optimist was the smoke coming out of the steamer. This is the Panther that they commissioned as a sealing vessel to ice sort of capable that they took up to the western coast of Greenland. And what it reminded me of was that there is this sort of longer history. These photographs sort of foreshadow the effects that we could think about these polar explorations having, these sort of ethical effects in this longer history of the production of pollution. And there's a wonderful book by a French philosopher named Michel Serres called Malfeasance, Appropriation Through Pollution. And for him, largely, he sees Western societies as advancing, in a political economic sense, this zone of appropriation, what can become commodities through the effects of pollution. So for me, these photographs really drew this line between this zone of appropriation and the actual very little pollution produced by this shift from sail to steam, and from that shift from sail to steam produced more frequent, more prolonged access into the Arctic Ocean. The second artifact, and I want to at least give it a bit of time, is a really remarkable film by Hunter Snyder. Hunter, are you here? There's Hunter, great. Hunter's a PhD student, as you see, in ecology, evolution, ecosystems, and society. He produced it, we were just chatting, and as it happened, we had both visited this remote hydroelectric plant in Western Greenland. It's only accessible by boat or helicopter, and we had both been there. And he made a film. When you were on a Fulbright as well? Yeah. In Greece? Yeah. So it was this great coincidence. And so yeah, I'll let you experience the artifact as I experienced it. If I can, oh, there it is. Okay, it should link. I'm actually just run it, and then I can give you my interpretation. So I'd be curious to talk about this with you after. So after I saw this film, in many ways, and it's a really remarkable film, to me, I saw Jens as a sort of allegorical figure that can allow us to make out how we can live with the mundane, everyday realities of climate change. In his world, as you've been seeing, you make do with the environment you inhabit. That is, you run and cycle up and down the plant's access tunnel. You maintain a sense of physical and mental readiness for forays out onto the land and water to hunt what you can. And much like the fast and steady water that flows through the plant to create the electricity for Nuke, Jens's work life is regulated by the increasing flow of glacial melt. By the film's end, it almost seems as if Jens and the hydroelectric station, as we saw, are interchangeable entities, generators of energy out of the environment. So for me, this film really serves as the perfect allegorical embodiment of the condition of Earth optimism. So it's not a condition of regress and retreat to some sort of pre-climate change world of balance. So Earth optimism, as represented in the film, is really a matter of learning to live within the machines that we as humans have created. That to some extent, the Earth and the Anthropocene has become one such machine is really a fact of life. And as Jens does, I would say it's up to us. Oh, now I've got to exit to give you my final slide. I'd say it's really up to us to, sorry, I'll go to the slideshow. I'd say it's up to us to really devise the day-to-day procedures that can, oh, here are the, oh, I may have stalled it. Oh, that's okay. I say it's up to us to really devise the day-to-day procedures to learn how to live within this the everyday reality of climate change. And hopefully you can watch the whole film one day. Maybe we can organize a screening and sort of learn to live like Jens. So thank you. Thanks for listening.
So we have some time for questions or comments. And you'll need to use one of the handheld microphones because we are recording this. There are a couple people running the mics around. So please, your reaction, questions. Can you start? So much of what I saw you speaking about towards the end of this, you know, as an ecologist, you know, we use the word adaptation.
Yeah.
Right? We talk about resilience and adaptation, and those are the words that we use for my discipline to sort of frame maybe what you're saying about Earth optimism, maybe? I mean, does that make any sense to you, or how do you react to the different words that different disciplines use to try to reach an understanding about the predicament that we're in?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in some of the work I do, adaptation is a pretty tricky term, right? Sometimes adaptation can imply that there's a responsibility, let's say on a particular Arctic community, that that the sort of primary agency is on them to learn to adapt to the conditions that have been created, as opposed to thinking about how Southern societies who bear the largest burden in producing those conditions haven't really learned to adapt in turn to some extent. So definitely, I mean, I think Earth optimism is this condition of living on a damaged planet. And so adaptation is to some extent trying to maintain this homeostatic principle of ecology. But I think there's often a sort of politics in the background to both of those terms that sometimes aren't fully foregrounded in some sort of policy-led approaches to ecological change, I would say. Yeah, but thanks.
So first, thank you for a definitely provocative talk.
Yeah.
I'd like to push you a little harder, though. When I first saw your phrase, Earth optimism, I thought where you were going to go was optimism for the persistence of Earth herself. But, essentially challenging us to not actually be so anthropocentric about all of this and to realize that whether we like it or not, we're not going to be on this planet forever. And that doesn't necessarily mean we should therefore give up and live it, just the high life and let the planet warm as worse as possible.
Yeah.
But if you carry that line of thinking far enough, and I don't know if you've read the work by Joanna Macy, she's written a very interesting book called Active Hope, where she sort of tries to deal with this. But if you carry that thread far enough, it leads you to a point of, if you can accept that there's a real possibility that we won't be here as long as perhaps we hoped humanity would be here, then in a way it releases you from despair and can get you into a position of really in a much more genuine, authentic way asking, what is the meaning of life? What does it mean to flourish? And then therefore, how can I, if I maybe avoid the word adaptation, how can I at least adjust my life or realign my life to do something of meaning, given all the uncertainty about exactly the pace at which climate change is going to happen. And at the same time, fight as hard as you can to help push all the actions at all various levels of our human organization to actually hope that we can stay well below 2 degrees centigrade. So I'm just curious as to, do you think that I'm crazy to say that?
No,
Or
absolutely.
are you going in that direction? Or I'm also curious to know why you didn't actually go that far
Fully,
with that phrase or the optimism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And so, for maybe the natural scientists in the room, in the humanities, generally in philosophy, there is a field called post-humanism, sort of thinking beyond this anthropocentric approach, and definitely I did think about going in that direction and thinking about this sort of you allude to human and non-human entities, right? And lots of interesting work coming out of anthropology about sort of interspecies relations, how you can think about the scale of bacteria, for instance, and how in some ways bacteria possess an ethics that humans can learn from. So for me, a sort of thinker that I think with is Mike Hume, who has sort of theorized this sort of inevitability of this damaged future. And for me, why hopefully you get to see the full film at some point, why Jens is this allegorical embodiment of what I call Earth optimism, is because maybe I think it has a nearer sense of the future, that term, than the one implied maybe in shifting towards this more interspecies type of thinking, where there are, to some extent, political, economic realities that we have to grapple with within the context of climate change, and the sort of short-term sustainability of certain human communities rely on sort of wading into those ethical gray zones. So for me, Earth optimism, it's problematic to not sort of cede the agency to the Earth itself. But what I was trying to allude to, about sort of recognizing this sort of machine Earth that we inhabit, is that the damage has been done, and we can't, becoming post-Anthropocene, isn't really going to happen to some extent. We can't, unless there's sort of mass extinction. This is sort of the condition we inhabit. Sort of wind-about answer, but I'll think about it more. Thank you for the comment and question.
Well, I guess the last one.
Yeah.
I'll just follow up on the first two questions, which is just about what, I guess the word that came up to me about a sort of an absence here, except for a very subtle presence of it in the first threshold, optimism, was a lack of what I would call resistance. This was all accommodation here of various different kinds. I hadn't even gotten yet to that, and I was just curious about, optimism and hope and all those things have been worked out or worked through in lots of different ways, right? About what that means. So for me, it was just a clear lack of even an image of resistance here.
Yeah.
So I was curious to throw that out and see where that landed with you and how deliberate that was or what. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, by no means, I sort of tried to throw a bit of a sort of caveat out there early on. This sort of spectrum of optimisms that I think could be worked through. Definitely, as we know, it's a very subjective sort of subject position. But resistance, yeah, I mean, I actually, to be honest, I haven't totally thought about it that much, because to me, the implied in these forms of resistance is this sort of this agonism of the present, trying to work out the conflict now, where definitely the stakes are a certain conception of the future, but nonetheless, there's this sort of near future, maybe this not open sense of hope that a lot of people articulate in certain climate-based resistance movements. But I have to think more about it. But thank you. I will integrate that into a fourth form of art.
This question in the back. Coming in.
Sorry about that. So, I know that we usually focus on the negative aspects of ice melt, especially in Greenland and the Arctic and the Antarctic. But as you pointed out, it's really very multifaceted. And do you think that there's a way to incorporate the positive consequences into our global discussion on anthropogenic climate change without maybe discouraging action?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Greenlandic case is going to be an interesting one to look at. A lot of people describe it as this sort of ground zero of climate change, right? And to some extent, there is this, when you think about a reestablishing of parameters, that includes, to some extent, environmental ethics, right? So if you think about ground zero of climate change, Greenland, to some extent, has the potential for us to project this new environmental ethics. And I'm not advocating by any means for these sort of emergent forms of extraction that Greenland presents, but it's ethically complicated, right? When you think about the potential to export hydroelectricity and really create an entirely new industry in Greenland, it's one that is tempting, and I think that won't be ignored by a lot of policy circles and things like that going into the future. So I think you have to hedge a bit and you have to work out the ethics of it. But nonetheless, I do think that's what I was trying to show. There is this sense of how you can tweak an optimism that doesn't discount what processes of environmental emergence, global warming makes apparent for particular communities. So it's very situated. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Well, I'd like to thank Rafico for an excellent talk. He generated a lot of ideas, and he's up on the third floor.
Yes.
And carry on this dialogue.
Definitely,
just
please.
crack the door open for a lot of interesting conversations. And welcome to Dartmouth, and Paulina the same.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.